way to just.
Is that okay?
Top.
That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some pictures and stuff, so darker is probably going to be a little better. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's all familiar faces, but I'm Rob Campbell. I'm an oceanographer here at the Science Center. I'm going to talk tonight about this cool Plankton camera that we built a little while ago, and shout out to my colleagues and co-authors, Jules Jaffe and Paul Roberts at the Scripps Institution, who actually built the thing.
Is this like the first one of its kind? You said they built it?
Kind of, yeah. Yeah. I'll explain
So
that.
it's prototypes.
Yeah, hopefully you've heard of the Gulf Watch project. It is a really huge, dozens of investigator research and monitoring effort focused at the spill impacted area, Exxon Valdez oil spill impacted area, with about a 20-year time horizon, and we're on year 7. There's many components, from Prince William Sound to Middleton Island to Cook Inlet, Kenai Fjords, everything from oceanography to birds, mammals. They're even trying to eradicate mink from Naked Island. My component of that is the Prince William Sound component, and we do just some basic oceanographic monitoring. We go out in our boat 6 to 10 times a year and do a lap of the sound at those red stations there. And we do the basic oceanographic measurements: temperature, salinity, oxygen. We do a plankton tow to see what's there, nutrient concentrations, stuff like that. That gives us a fairly good idea of the seasonality of what's happening in the sound. But we are very limited by weather, like most people, because our boat isn't very big. And things can change pretty quickly. So there's been a lot of work in the last decade in oceanography to develop autonomous vehicles that we can either leave out or send out to collect data for us. So we can go to places that we couldn't get to because of the weather, or we can sample at much higher frequency than we usually do to get a better picture of what is happening in the ocean. And so to add that onto our Gulf Watch activities, in 2014, we put in a mooring. It's about 5 miles due east of Naked Island. And it's a tethered robot float. I think I've given talks about this previously, so it's probably be a little familiar. It's about as tall as me. It has all kinds of instruments on it. It has a CTD for measuring temperature and salinity and pressure. Pressure just tells you depth. Basically, the amount of water pushing down on your sensor tells you how much water is above it. There is a fluorometer that measures chlorophyll, which gives us an idea of plant plankton biomass, and a turbidometer, which gives us an idea of water cloudiness, all that wonderful glacial flour that's getting washed out into the sound that you can see after a storm can affect light penetration in the ocean. We have a sensor on there that can measure nitrate concentrations, NO3. Nitrate is the limiting nutrient pretty much all the time in coastal Alaska, and kind of is the limiter of productivity ultimately, and oxygen. It's battery powered, and it can connect in through the cell network. And then below that, there are a couple of current meters as well, so we also can measure how the water's moving around. All right, and because I'm an oceanographer, you gotta have a cool acronym, so I'm calling it PAMPER, Prince William Sound Autonomous Moored Profiler. So here is how it works. It is sitting on a tether, moored out in the sound, and it's sitting at about 55 to 60 meters. And most of the time it's just sitting there asleep. It's well away from the surface, so it isn't going to be damaged by weather, and it's not going to get run over by a boat or anything. But at a specified interval, set by me, lately we've been doing it twice a day, it wakes up and it starts rising up towards the surface. And it does that at about 30 centimeters per second. And while it does that, it measures all those wonderful oceanographic parameters: temperature, salinity, nitrate, etc. And this is just some example data from summer to show what it's doing. When it gets to the surface, it connects into the cell network. It says, hey Rob, I'm at the surface. Should I do something different? It'll send out a little bit of data, and then it will winch itself back down to its parking depth and go back to sleep. And with our very big 1.5 kilowatt, $30,000 battery, we can do twice-a-day profiles for something like 4 to 6 weeks. Then we have to go out there, we recharge the battery, we pull data off it, fix what's broken, stuff like that. And just to give you an idea of the kind of data we get out of this, and kind of as an aside, because people are always asking me what's going on in the sound these days, this is the data record from when we first started putting it in 2014 on the top there, and each panel is another year. And this is temperature that I have converted into temperature anomaly. So that just removes the average seasonal cycle from it. And so it's just a quick and easy way to compare your temperature with what the average is. So with this, red colors are warmer than average, and the blue cooler colors are cooler than average. 2014, we put it in the spring and it broke immediately and kind of only had the spring, but 2014 was the first year of the big heat wave that we had starting in late 2013. And so this has a pretty good record of that marine heat wave as it manifested in Prince William Sound. Just so everybody's clear, on this axis here, this is depth. So this is the surface right here, and this is 60 meters at the bottom. That's the way oceanographers like to do it. You put the surface at the top, so it's kind of like you're looking at it from the side. And then this is just time of the year along the bottom here, and it's the same in every figure. So starting off in spring, summer, and then around autumn time, the weather starts getting kind of miserable, so it's hard to service the thing, and all the instruments have to go back for calibration. So we usually end around August and send everything down. And that's actually where all the instruments are right now. They're all in Washington getting calibrated. But yeah, you can really see how warm it was in 2015, 2016, even in 2017. All the surface layer temperatures were something like 2-4 degrees above average. So really, really, really warm. And it shows how you can, with twice daily casts, how quickly things can change. You can see little cold events and warm events and stuff like that. Now, temperature salinity is pretty easy to measure. Temperature, you just have a wire, you put some current through it, and the resistance tells you the temperature. Conductivity, you put some electricity through a cell, and the conductivity tells you how much salt is in it. So you can just have a machine that will give you that quantity. But when you're thinking about keeping track of the ecosystem, it's a lot tougher. There's no such thing as a planktotron to tell what kind of plankton are there. So the way people have been doing that for the last decade and a half is in situ cameras. So we can see where things are and have an idea of what they are. And so in 2016, I got a little bit of money from the North Pacific Research Board. It's actually a lot of money to get a camera to put onto this profiler so we could add observations of plankton over time to match up with all those other things that we're measuring. And I'd actually originally planned to buy the only commercially available plankton camera, which is out of France, but then I saw the pictures for it and they kind of sucked. So I started sending some emails around and doing some basically Google searching, and I found this Scripps Plankton camera that Jules Jaffe and Paul Roberts had developed at the Scripps Institution. And the website there, spcUCSD.edu, has their observations, because it's basically attached to the Scripps pier with a cable running off of it, so they can run it and have data coming off of it in real time. Theirs is quite small. It images a very small amount of water, but I thought it was kind of a cool system. So I basically wrote them an email and said, hey, I have a lot of money and I want to get a camera system. What do you say we take your camera system and just make it really big? And they said, yeah, cool, let's do that. And so that's what led to this design. So it's based on their design, but it was the biggest one that had been built to date. And actually it's worked out well enough from our little project that they've since made 5 or 6 more of these. So they're getting put on profiling things on ships and stuff like that. Yeah, so it's just a schematic of what you see sitting in front of you. It's got illumination on one side and a camera on the other. And I'll just fire it up here. It'll take it a minute to boot up. But it's got what's called a telecentric lens, and it's a really, really big lens, which is why it has that big housing. Those are used for machine vision type things because the interesting property of a telecentric lens is that what you image with it stays in focus no matter where it is in the image volume. So if you have a fixed camera and you're taking a picture of something and move it away, it will tend to get blurry. But with the telecentric lens, the optics are all parallel, so that doesn't happen. So it means things are more often in focus. Now this has a 12 megapixel camera that'll do about 7 frames per second, and it has a ridiculous color depth. It's 16 bits, so 2 to the power of 16, whatever that is. Oh, there it's firing up. So if we were to keep every picture it took at 7 times a second, it would make about 40 megabytes per second. So we would fill up, say, a DVD of space in a few minutes. And memory's kind of cheap these days, but it's not that cheap. So to get around that, inside the electronics can right here, we have a little Odroid computer, which is basically like one of these without a screen on it. It has 8 processors, or an 8-core processor on it. So it can actually do a lot of math really, really quickly. And so what it does as it's banging away there is it takes each image and it looks within it. So here's a picture that was actually taken out in Prince William Sound. That's a big copepod on the top there. And you can actually see all kinds of other stuff here. This was taken during the spring bloom, and that's all little phytoplankton cells that this guy's actually eating. So what it does is it takes the picture and it looks for edges, basically, and tries to decide where the particles are. And it does what is called binarization. So it makes a mask, and it says, okay, everything in this white area is something. Great. It will then, crop it out, take that, basically cut a square around it and save just that image. And so because plankton are generally pretty dilute, most of the image will just have blank space on it. So it discards all of that blank space and actually just records all the pictures of actual plankton. And that is saved internally onto that, and then we download that every 4 to 6 weeks when we go and bring it into service. It's generally something like 3 to 5 gigabytes of those just plankton images that are taken in 4 to 6 weeks. So it's way, way more than we could ever put through a cell connection. The thing would be sitting at the surface for hours. So it has to sit there until we go and collect it, and then load it down onto the computer so we can take it back and deal with it. And yeah, what else do I have to say about that? I guess you guys can come have a closer look at it after the talk, but yeah, it basically, we've got it set for, I think it's 4 times a second. It has all the illumination on this side. It has a ring illumination and then a whole bunch of lenses on the back. So it makes what is called a dark field image. So it just illuminates the plankton, and in a perfect world you would see nothing but blackness behind it. In reality, there is stuff floating around in the water, so it's not quite that perfect.
So the organism you have with there, is that a Calanus or something?
Yeah, that is a Neocalanus cristatus. I can tell because it has a pointy head and it's absolutely gigantic.
So the camera just like grabs an image of what's like the clearest most focused thing you can see, and then it just chooses that's the image it's gonna isolate. You're not telling it to isolate it, it's just kind of
Right.
making that judgment call on each frame.
Basically, every time that camera flashes, it is taking the entire frame, and the computer is then looking for edges. And it will say, okay, there's a particle, and then it just cuts those out and saves those particles to the disk. on
So
the
you
board.
could get more than one
Oh yeah,
organism per image.
oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Our maximum rate is something like 200 of those. We call them ROEs, regions of interest. About 200 of those per second.
That's a lot of data to store.
Yes, yes it is. Let's see here. And yeah, that's what it looks like on the profiler. It's just basically hanging out off the side. So as the profiler moves up, it has more or less a free stream of water that's passing through that little tunnel to image the plankton. The reason it's not going at 7 times per second is because at 30 centimeters per second ascent rate, 4 hertz, we're basically taking an image every 7 centimeters so they don't overlap. If we were doing 7 times per second, we would actually be taking pictures of the same thing several times as it went past.
Is there a reason you orient it horizontally as opposed to vertically?
You mean like straight up and down? Yeah, because the profiler sits like this down in the water, and so as it rises up, this is basically hanging out as far to the side as I dare put it. So it is away from the profiler and presumably going through a more or less undisturbed bit of water. Plankton are covered in sensors looking for any kind of disturbance, and they'll avoid any kind of hydrodynamic disturbance, be it a camera or a net or whatever. And I'll show you some pictures. You can actually tell sometimes when they're reacting to it.
Does it only take pictures when it's going up and down, or does it take pictures also when it's parked?
Only on the upcast. I had tried to get the engineers to do it on the downcast as well, so we could sample twice the water, but I was not able to get them to do that. They said it would cost too much money. But yeah, it's basically off when it's parked at depth to save power, basically. So here are plots of those ROEs, those regions of interest, and it's the same format as I showed you with that temperature anomaly plot. So surface up here, 60 meters down here, March through December. And so these are actually, there's a little dot here for every observation, and the color of that dot is proportional to the number of those ROEs it was collecting. And I've log transformed it so you can see some of the finer differences. And so looking at, like, say 2016 up here, this is around spring, late springtime. There's lots and lots of something there at that time. And that happens, pretty much every spring, and then as we move into summer, less so, maybe a little peak in autumn. And the white spaces are where there is no data, and that's the one frustration with this profiler, is that it breaks sometimes, and it's not the kind of thing that I can wrench on and fix immediately. So several times it is broken, and it's had to go home to Oregon to get fixed, and that takes days to weeks. Was it 2016? I think it was back here. We tested it out in the inlet. It was not working. Right after they had sent it back, so I called them and said, Caitlin is on her way. She will be watching you as you fix it, and we'll bring it back. Yeah, actually the same thing happened. That's this year. Late August, it just stopped working, and so it all had to go back down to get fixed, and they didn't get it back to us till October. So there was a gap. So Not much one can do about that. The whole thing costs like $250,000, $300,000. So getting another one, so we always have something put out there, is non-trivial. Maybe someday. Yeah, and actually, just to quickly show how this lines up with some of the other biology stuff, in the overlay here, the green dots are just the depth of the maximum chlorophyll, so the maximum biomass of phytoplankton, and the white line is isotherm of nitrate at 4 micromolar. Phytoplankton are super great at taking up nitrate. They basically use it all up in the surface layer after the spring. And so throughout June, July, August, there's often really not detectable nitrate at the surface. So I just use 4 micromolar as a quick and dirty diagnostic of like the surface layer where things are actually happening. And it actually matches up kind of nicely. You can see where the zooplankton is all happening up in that surface layer for the most part. The other thing I'd like to point out, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you zoom in PowerPoint today, and you just can't. But you can see, especially here, there's this banding where there's light color and then dark color, light color, dark color. And that's from what we call diel changes. Basically since 2016, I have it do a profile at 1:30 in the morning and 1:30 in the afternoon. 1:30 or 1:30, yeah, in the afternoon. 1:30 in the afternoon is about when the sun is at its highest and solar insolation is at its maximum, and then 1:30 at night is about when it's darkest. And so that banding is caused by different plankton showing up at different times of the day. And you can actually see this just looking at some of the pictures. So this is just it's a quick and easy way to look at some of the pictures that it's collected. So this is a daytime cast. There's some big copepods, echidnath. I'll show you some more pictures later. A few smaller copepods, like so. Now, this one is 12 hours later, basically. That's a big predatory echidnath. I'll show you more of that later. There's a few copepods, more copepods, lots of copepods, more. So there's 2 or 3 times more copepods in that nighttime cast. And so basically what they're doing is they're hanging out at depth during the day. This is a really common thing. Any kind of visual predator is going to be able to see them during the day. So they will hang out at depth where it's dark during the day and then come up to the surface at night to feed. And so we see that just in the number of particles that the camera is capturing. And yeah, I have lots and lots of pictures, but I thought I'd show you some of the better ones of some of the bigger things that we encounter more often. Most of the images that are easily decipherable are copepods. This is actually up here. This is a predatory copepod. It has grasping forelegs, kind of like a praying mantis. And it's kind of the aquatic version of a praying mantis. It just hangs out motionless, waiting for something to come near and nabs it. And actually that's another one there. The reason I throw that in is because I mentioned that they have all kinds of sensors for detecting hydrodynamic cues. It may be tough for the guys at the back, but you can see some of these little sensory hairs that they have hanging out in the front there. The rest of these are herbivorous copepods. You recognize that one. I showed you that one already. These 2 in the middle here are actually reacting to the camera. You can see this guy on the top here, his antennae are kind of bending back as he books it away from the camera. And then this is a side view of a copepod of about the same size. And these are swimming legs right here that are activating as they try to get away from the pressure wave of the camera. I just threw this one in. This is, see this sometimes, two individual plankters in frame. We're often like 1,000 to 10,000 individuals per cubic meter is quite a lot of plankton. So to be seeing two in the same frame like that means that they can be really, really abundant. The other cool thing about these is these big calanoid copepods have lipid sacs in their body that they use to store energy, and you can make that out. We can even hopefully size it eventually. Also, being totally transparent, you can see their guts. So this guy here, you can see his green gut from all of the plant plankton that he's eaten, and that he is about to take a poop. Another really common group around here are the pteropods. Those are planktonic snails. Ptero means wing, pod means foot, wing foot. You might have heard of Limacina, all these guys on the left here. They actually do have a shell, and they're at risk with the ocean becoming more acidic. They're super neat. They have these little, I always think of them as like ping pong paddles that they use to swim around.
How big are they, Rob?
A really, really big one is about 4 millimeters. And often in the summer, when they first start to show up in our plankton sample, it looks like little grains of sand on the bottom, and that's those things. They're a millimeter or less when they're small. They're deposit feeders. They actually secrete a web of mucus, snot, and things stick to it, and then they eat it all back up. Yeah. And then on the right here, this is Cleone. It is also a snail, but it doesn't have an external shell. It has sort of enveloped it into its body. It has a little internal shell. These are called Limacina helicina, and these are called Cleone limacina. And the reason for that is because these guys eat these guys. They have these really cool mouth parts that they actually reach right into the shell and pull the little guy out and swallow him whole.
What are those bumps that look like horns do?
Yeah, they're presumably antennae of some sort for detecting prey as they swim around. The common name for them are sea angels. I don't know if anybody's heard of those. They're oddly popular in Japan. I've seen Hello Kitty Cleones. Yeah, and they're to see them live, they're really beautiful. They just kind of slowly cruise around, flapping their wings, looking for something to eat, and then when they encounter one of those Limacina, it's on. And yeah, their body totally changes as they tear the little snail from its house. These are tudicates of various types. They have a notochord, so they're actually more closely related to us than, say, copepods or snails. They can be really tough to identify when we're dragging our plankton nets around, because as they bump down the plankton net, they are turned into goo. So cameras are really great for identifying these in situ. Yeah, the ones on the left, I don't really know that much about. On the right, this is a Larvae Ssin. They actually live inside a house of snot. They're kind of like a tadpole. They have a head and a tail, and they sit in there and wriggle their tail and pump water through their snot house. And they have little, basically filters in there that phytoplankton get caught in, that they then eat them off of. And when there's a lot of phytoplankton around, the house will actually clog. So they'll actually just wriggle out and give up on that and make themselves a brand new one. So when they're starting to clog, they're easier to see. This one here, a lot of the house is kind of invisible because it's just snot. It's
So is that what that kind of feathery looking stuff coming up is?
Yeah, right off there is
Yeah.
is some of
Building
the
is not a
house.
house.
Yeah,
He's remodeling.
Plankton love their snot. These are some ctenophores. They're a kind of gelatinous plankton, but different from jellyfish. There's two types here on the left. It's Pleurobrachia and what's the other one? Oh no, the other Pleurobrachia like one.
Phalaenopsis.
Phalaenopsis. Yeah. And I can't tell them apart. Caitlin's the expert. They're super neat. They're called ctenophores because they have these rows of little paddles. They're called teens, and you can just make them out on, where did my mouse go? On this guy here, and actually that's why I included this one. This is like a top view, and you can see all these little rows here, which are their little paddles that they use to swim around. These kind have two tentacles that they trail out behind them. So this is one fishing right here. You can see his tentacles, and they have little hairs with little bits of adhesive on them. And anything that hits that tentacle will stick to it. And then they'll draw the tentacle up and eat whatever happens to be stuck to it. And so this picture here is one where its tentacles are completely clogged with what looks to be like phytoplankton that it's drawn back in to eat, basically. And then on the other side here, these are lobate ctenophores, and they are engulfing predators. So this is what they look like when they're just cruising around, but when they encounter prey, they have these huge lobes that they can open up and engulf their prey. They'll eat smaller versions of themselves. They'll eat ctenophores or whatever they can get their lips around. If you're out in autumn and looking at your prop wash after dark, you'll often see these big glows. That's usually those guys. They can glow really, really brightly blue. We see lots of various types of jellies. I don't know any of their names. These are cnidarians. They have stinging cells like a sea nettle, like you see floating around. These are generally, the ones we see are a lot smaller because we're sampling a fairly small amount of water. These also tend to get messed up by a plankton net, so using a camera we get a much better idea of who is there. And these are chaetognaths, also known as arrow worms. Chaeto means brush, gnath means mouth, and they have these kind of brushy spine things on their mouths that are actually tipped with a neurotoxin. And their strategy for life is kind of like that praying mantis copepod I mentioned. They're totally covered in sensors and they're totally clear, and they just drift around waiting for something to come close, and then they'll detect it and lunge at it. And if they can get their spikes on it and inject that neurotoxin, it's basically game over. And on the left here's a copepod, and this is the same picture. A copepod and a chaetognath in close proximity.
How do they lunge?
They can't see it too super well. They have a little tail, so just like a fish, they can anchor themselves in the water and lunge forward. The smaller something is, the stickier water is to them. So to them, it's sort of like us trying to swim in molasses. The water is a lot more viscous, so they can get a lot better purchase on it.
The surface tension?
Or molecular? I'll ask the physicist over there. I think it would be the hydrogen bonding, right?
Yeah, I have to look that one back up. It's basically that you are getting down to where molecules look big.
Right. So yeah, that's all the fun big ones. But the reality of plankton distributions is that most of the plankton out there are teeny tiny. This is what we call a frequency histogram. So along the bottom here is actually just file size of those rowies, which is a rough measure of the size of the plankton. And on the side here is just how often we see it. So most of the plankton images we get, hundreds of thousands of them, are little tiny things. Right, and I actually totted up how far we've gotten so far. We've got a little over 2.3 million images so far, totaling about 63 gigabytes in our 3 years of deployment so far. And yeah, most of those images look something like that. They're little lumpy things. And then towards the tail, less frequent are those bigger images that we can get a lot more information out of. Right, I didn't mention the resolution on that camera is about 20 or 25 microns. So that's our lower limit of things that we can resolve. But obviously you need several pixels to tell what something is. And so to deal with that, I've been doing a lot of work the last few months trying to train my computer upstairs to identify these images, because there's millions of them. We literally can't do it by hand, and they're just, every year we get more of them. They just keep coming in. But this is a real growth area in engineering and data science right now, is using what they call machine vision or machine classification to identify things. And yeah, this is a little cartoon from XKCD about what's easy and what's not so easy. She is, isn't she? And yeah, what we use are neural networks, and you've maybe heard about that. And I thought I'd try to give you a brief overview of what that is and how that works. And as an example, a simpler example, pretend you're trying to predict what a house is going to sell for, and you have various parameters, inputs, like bedrooms, size, where it is, if it's in a nice neighborhood or a not nice neighborhood. And so you can take that data and do a little math on it, multiply it by some number, the number isn't important, to arrive at your price estimate. And we call those weights when doing that kind of operation. Of course, that's a very simple model, and it's not probably going to hold for all houses. Maybe the size of the house matters less if it's a really nice neighborhood. Maybe the number of bedrooms doesn't matter if it's huge, stuff like that. So in practice, you might have to start making more models to try and incorporate these different permutations of your inputs, your bedrooms, house size, and where it's at. And so then you get a variety of different estimates for in this example, and so then you have to take those and distill them into your final guess. And so instead of doing that, you can just combine everything. And this is basically what they call a neural network, where you are taking multiple inputs, doing some intermediary math on them to come up with output. And in our case, what we want is a prediction. Yeah, this is, it's more than a talk into itself, it's probably a whole course. And so when doing images, a digital picture is really just an array of numbers, right? So here is a slightly goofy letter 8, and then the data that sort of makes up that picture. So the white pixels are 0, and if you look at the darker ones, they all go up to 255. That's like an 8-bit image like you get from your cell phone, basically. And so you can use all of those numbers in these neural networks to try and do some predictions. And this is a well-known data set that data scientists and machine vision people have used as a kind of a test problem. And these are just a collection of hand-drawn digits. And if you look at them, you can see that, you know, it's very obvious to us what each one is, but they are quite different from digit to digit. So the challenge is trying to train a computer to discriminate that. And I even noticed over here, this, like, is that an 8 or a 9? Who knows? And so you can take a much more elaborate neural network than I showed you in that example and feed that data into it. So here's one of those digits. It's a 28 by 28 pixel image, which equals 784 separate pixels. And you basically can feed those numbers into your network. Some math happens, and it will come up with a prediction. And basically different parts of the network will activate based on different digits coming through. And this is actually very similar to the way our brains work, which is why it's called a neural network. But this is the best, simplest explanation I could find. In computer science, there's daemons for like networking and stuff like that. So someone decided to call them daemons. And so this one actually starts from the bottom here with our A, and it gets passed into that network, and each of those daemons are nodes of that network. And this daemon is looking for up and down, this daemon is looking for left, right, examples. You know, some are looking for curves, shapes, things like that. And so the different daemons will activate differently to that letter. The angular ones are like, oh yeah, high number. The curvy ones are like, no, that's not us. And then that gets passed to another layer in the network that are actually talking to all the other daemons below it and saying, okay, well, I'm A, I think it's an A, whereas the O guy's like, no, not at all. And then at the end, you have some kind of decision-making math that happens as well. And in practical terms, what we're trying to do is get a probability of, say, A. So it'll say, it's an A, and I'm 99% sure it's an A, or it's an A, but 75% sure. So you can kind of scale your output to make it a little more useful. And going back to that cartoon I showed you, of course, data scientists saw that cartoon and were like, well, let's make a neural net and see if we can tell a bird from not a bird. And so they just took a bunch of example images, a bunch of them are on the top, and built up one of those neural networks and tried it out. And they were able to get like 90 to 95% accuracy from these pretty low resolution images. And so that's what I am now trying to do with our plankton image data set. But this is turning out to be a lot trickier than, say, things like handwritten digits or bird or not bird, because the data set, the images are pretty messy. They go from very, very big to very, very small. Some are sharper than others. If there's a lot of cloudiness in the water, that seems to create more scattering, so the images aren't quite as good. The plankton can be in any number of orientations, so the same species of animal will look quite different depending on which way it's pointing. And some things like we can't identify, so it's not really practical to try and get a computer to do that as well. And yeah, when you're identifying handwritten digits, you know that it's either a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. But we're still discovering what we have in our data set of images. And because there is so many of them, and the interesting ones are comparatively rare, it is tricky to find them, to have them, to train up these machine vision techniques to identify it. And so what I've been using most recently, like yesterday, is a very, very elaborate neural network that was actually developed by Google, and it's called Inception V3. And so each of those little nodes in there is like one of those big networks of anywhere between 36 and 256 separate nodes. And they're all interconnected and talking to one another. And there's various mathematical tricks that they do to try and keep it from getting too specific. Just like humans have a good memory, a neural net can have a good memory, so you can actually train it such that it just knows what every image is because it's seen it before and can identify it. So we're trying to get something that's kind of general, so it will say, okay, that's a copepod. It's not going to say, oh, it's that copepod I saw 3 hours ago, which is a little tricky. It's part art, part science.
Is this what they're using for face recognition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very similar problem. And yeah, we use a lot of the tricks that they've come up with. Some of our images that Caitlin has identified that we use to train, we only have a couple of dozen images, and it's looking at millions. So we do little tricks like take one image and rotate it a little bit, or flip it one way, or change the color a little bit, so we can get more data to plug in there, which is what they also do with face recognition. And yeah, nowadays you can buy these processing units. I have one in my computer upstairs. They're basically really fancy video cards, but they just have a lot of processors inside of them. That has about 2,500 separate processors, so it's kind of like having 2,500 computers at your disposal. So this can all be fed through there fairly quickly, and yeah, you can do things with this that you could never do on a singular computer. So to train up a network like this, it kind of depends on how much data goes in, but it takes hours to days just to train it to identify things, and then you can use it to classify images and see how it does, and it'll do I think it's about 10 microseconds per image, so it actually takes hours to days to go through my entire data set. So it's been kind of frustratingly slow, but progress is incremental. And just to give you an idea of what I'm getting out of this, and this is hot off the presses, this is the groups that Caitlin has identified going through subsets of the images. There's 37 different classes. Some are individual copepod species, some are individual jelly plankton species, some are just weird things, like there's one with these weird dot things, we don't even know what they are, but they all look the same, so we try to classify them. And overall, this was getting to about 75% accuracy. So 75% of the time it would identify a plankton image correctly. But the real devil is in the details. And this is called a confusion matrix. And it's just on the left-hand side here is what the images actually are. And then on the bottom here is what the neural network thinks they are. So in an ideal world, every element on this diagonal would be 1. It would be perfect at identifying every copepod as being a copepod. But in practice, it gets a little confused. So you can see here, like Calanus is a copepod, and it's actually misclassifying about 40% of the time as Neocalanus down here, which is a very similar looking copepod. And so yeah, I've just color coded it. The darker blue it is, the better it is. So it's getting in the right direction, but there's still lots of confusion between the groups. And so right now, I'm in this tuning process where I tinker with the model. I hired an engineer to add some code so we could just add the size of the plankton, because your stock neural net won't do that, but the size of the particle tells you something about what it's likely to be. And so, yeah, we're trying to get to where we can be confident in what it's identifying, and then start doing the actual science with it. And yeah, that's where I am.
It looks like some things, though, it's recognizing fairly well.
Yeah. In general, all the blue on that diagonal is what you want to see. So for some things, it's doing a great job. Others, not so much. And it's kind of fuzzy. Like having it detect a copepod, it can do fairly well at that, but there are lots of different kinds of copepods. So I'm just trying to get to that happy medium where it will give me the level of resolution that I can use and not lose a lot of the details in a small number of classes.
But goodness, this is light years ahead of where even a few years ago.
Yeah, it is really growing in leaps and bounds, and there's a lot of engineers and data scientists who are working on this really heavily. And now that Bitcoin has tanked, Bitcoin was a major competitor for those GPU processors. They're really cheap now. Everybody's buying them. Yeah, so that's all I have for you. Thanks to Caitlin, long-suffering Caitlin, Bruce Rhodes, who built the profiler, and Brendan Smith at NPRB, who did some work with us with images. Funding from the ExxonMobil Oil Trustee Council, North Pacific Research Board, and shout out to the Railroad Corp for giving me train notes, which are really good anchors.
Wow.
Yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be delighted.
So any of these pictures being disseminated and are you getting better pictures than other people have?
Yeah. When I bought it, there was kind of two choices in the kind of camera I could get. The one we wound up getting is a quite high resolution, full color camera. And the reason I went with that is the images are nice, and the color can actually be a diagnostic to different kinds of plankton. Like a lot of copepods have some red in them, and a lot of phytoplankton is green or brown colored. So I was hoping that we could use the color information to back more out of it. The competing system is what they call a shadow graph. And that is literally just shining light on a parcel of water and then imaging the shadow of the plankton. So you get the silhouette, but none of the color or the interior stuff. So
No 3D.
yeah, you can sample more water with the shadow graph, but there's less information in those images. So there's no right answer. I just really like the images that the system is producing, so I went with that.
The initial identification of an organism, though, is purely just looking at it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do a plankton tow every time we're there to service it, so we do have actual samples we can look at under the microscope to get an idea with a different method. But yeah, right now it's basically Caitlin sitting at a computer for a really long time looking at lots of images.
So are you guys, are there things here that when you send it out to other people, they're going, whoa, never seen this?
Not so much for the plankton, because plankton are really cosmopolitan. They get mixed all over the ocean, all over the place, and they've been studied for hundreds of years. So the odds of us seeing something new are quite low. But yeah, this is the first camera system that had the resolution and the color, so you can actually see food in their guts, or actually see their fat deposits.
So I bet a lot of other people would enjoy these photos.
Yeah, and as we get better at cleaning them up, we'll definitely be posting them, and ideally I'd like to get some machine vision experts really interested in the problem.
Uh-huh.
But so far they're identifying letters and numbers and pictures, faces.
Why that spot? Why did you pick that spot for the food?
There was a weather buoy there during the sea project years in the 90s, so there was a little bit of data from that place originally. It's the central sound, but it's sort of out of the tanker lanes, couldn't have it anywhere near the tanker lanes, and it's far north enough that the tenders aren't going over top as well, so it's just sort of a quieter corner of the sound, but still out in the central sound.
So do you think that your individual images can be used to kind of give you a estimate of the population, the biomass that's out there?
Yeah, definitely. Once they're identified, like sizing them
Yeah.
is super trivial. That's very easy to do with the computer. And then if you know, say it's a copepod, you know how long it is, you have an idea of the geometry of its body.
Yeah.
I could calculate a volume which would be proportional to its mass, and we could even calibrate that with actual samples.
But how do you deal with the avoidance?
There's not much you can do about it. They avoid nets too.
Yeah.
Yeah, most plankton people still just use nets, and so they say, oh, they'll avoid the camera, but they're known to avoid the nets too. There's no silver bullet for observing plankton in situ.
Could you not streamline the support structure there to create less of a vortex?
Could do. We talked about that, but there's still going to be things happening from the faces, where the optics, the camera, and the lights are, and yeah. So figured the addition would be marginal, and we really can't back the camera or the light away too much because the water is cloudy. And so the further apart they get, the lower quality the images are. So it was in the picture. The actual image area is about 7 centimeters, so it is kind of in the middle. And
Sounds like you're getting plenty of images.
yeah, and just looking at the images, I do see them doing pretty characteristic escape poses, but most of them are not. Most of them are undisturbed.